behavior. I stopped next to him and said, "Sir, is there something you'd like to tell me?" I didn't say his name. He could always claim that he didn't know me. He lowered his eyes and whispered, "Frau Heiselberg is very ill." His mother whispered something to her that didn't reach Thomas's ears as he stood by the door, and Frau Stein nodded with understanding. Thomas was overcome with disgust. It was all too familiar. All the hundreds of mornings the two of them had sat, glued to each other in the bedroom, sharing one secret after another. Anyone who came anywhere near felt as though he were invading a kingdom where there was no room for anyone else. Frau Stein arranged the pillows under his mother's head, stroked her hair, and then leaned over and buried her face in his mother's bosom. "Marlene, how did this happen?" she whispered. "How did this happen?" The two women made the gap that had yawned between them for the past 8 years disappear with such ease, as if a curtain had been moved aside and the previous landscape revealed. Here they were again, a dreamy mistress who had rarely descended to the world just in order to remember its harshness and take off again, and housekeeper who had become her good friend and had slowly taken charge of her duties, and by so doing, raised the wall that separated her mistress from the world. It seemed that they were now rebelling against the scraps of time that still remained, mourning the years that had passed, and the hours that were slipping away. "Do you want to protect her as you used to, Frau Stein?" Thomas thought in anger and turned away from them. "Do you want to protect her from the years she has sacrificed, the injustices that have stained her wedding dress, the errors? In order to protect her, you have to sketch the figure of a hangman. Look, here's a hangman, a horrible illness that lays your mistress's body to waste and stubbornly pushes her toward death, and you still believe you can do something for her?" Thomas stood in the spacious parlor. Following his mother's instructions, the thick velvet curtains were always drawn. He turned on a lamp, next to which stood the sofa with down pillows on it, and shifted his gaze to the statue replicas, Auguste Rodin, the porcelain Arc de Triomphe, and a little gilded Buddha, a gift she had received from a scholar she had met when she was young, and under whose influence she had become interested in the religions of the Far East. Above the statuette of the Buddha, on a shelf, stood a picture of Ernst Junger with a dedication, "To Marlene, whose curiosity is so marvelous." Artificial plants surrounded the arched fireplace, decorated with dove tiles that featured silly pictures of lakes and windmills. He had always felt dizzy at the sight of the parlor, confronted by the welter that was intended to emphasize its mistress's broadness of mind. He decided to ignore what was happening in the bedroom, sat at the desk, and made a few last corrections in the speech he was going to give that evening at the meeting with the directors of Daimler-Benz. His ambition was that at the end of the evening, they would realize that the Milton Company was the answer to all their needs. It was a real shame that little Frau Stein had not come across certain articles in the newspaper where his name was mentioned. For some mysterious reason, his acquaintances never read the right page of the right newspaper on the right day, so she didn't know about his success. While his father and his unemployed friends marched the streets of Berlin dressed up as tires, as sandwiches, or as chocolate bars, he had already thought of an original and highly inspired plan. One day, about 2 years after he finished his university studies, he had read that the Milton Market Research Company was planning to open a branch in Germany. That American company, which had branches all over the world but only one in Europe, in England of all places, had kindled his imagination even when he was still a student. He had made friends with an American student of economics who told him about Milton and its advanced market research, which was at least 10 years ahead of Europe. That had been one of the only points of light in his studies at the University of Berlin. In the early 20s, he had of course been interested in social sciences and had even considered studying linguistics, but in the end, inspired by his mother, believed that a change would take place in his spirit if he enrolled at a university that took pride in its first-class intellectuals. He studied philosophy. Mostly his studies had seemed like a waste of time to him, and as soon as he received the degree of magister, he left, never to return. In the winter of 1926, when he was 23, he traveled to London and met an American named Jack Fisk, the director of the European Department of Milton Market Research. He had devoted months, with the help of an American teacher he had hired, to polish up his English in preparation of the speech he intended to give there. He sat in the upholstered leather chair in the spacious office of the director, whose wrinkled face and thick mustache looked rather impressive. With great curiosity examined a gigantic blue, red, and white map of the world, which had numerous flags marking the Milton branches pinned to it. Upon seeing that elaborate map, he knew he had been right. Inspired by a remark of Schopenhauer's, at least one useful thing he had gleaned from his studies, Americans might say of their own vulgarity what Cicero said of science, nobiscum peregrinator, come along with us. He decided to adopt a somewhat blunt and simplistic approach, who put off most German executives, and discovered that his decision was correct. The director eyed him suspiciously, as if he could not understand where this young Berliner had sprung up from with his flashy suit, a blue handkerchief tied around his neck in the French style, and a carnation pinned to his lapel. Thomas crossed his long legs, offered his host some fine Dutch tobacco, lit his pipe, and asked in a friendly way what had inspired the choice of a desk in the shape of a pirate ship. Then he began his speech. Dear Mr. Fisk, I read about your plan to open a new branch of Milton on the continent in the near future, and indeed in my hometown, Berlin. First, allow me to congratulate you on behalf of my fellow Berliners. As an experienced market researcher, you ought to have learned about your chances in the European market in depth. However, you certainly must have learned a lesson from the limited achievements of your branch in England. Let's face it, Milton has stumbled on his path in Europe, and you might even say, with regret, that you haven't yet reached the continent. A small prediction. It will be even harder in Berlin. How do I know? It's simple. Every community has its own system of assumptions, and the parameters of market research that have been applied to the Americans won't do well in characterizing us Germans. From my sources, I've learned that in your meetings with German companies, you boast about Milton's research methods, telling everyone that they are science. But remember, the aura of science is in fact a tall tale, and though you manage to sell it to a few gullible Germans who love to scientificate everything, we both know that in 2 years, even the most gullible will realize that your methods aren't effective in Germany, and they'll kick you out of the market. The only science that works here is the science of the Germans' national spirit. And you, my dear sir, suddenly show up with your bundle of dollars and want to teach them how to spend their money? My dear sir, you don't understand Germanness. Indeed, you are neither the first nor the last. Germanness is hard to understand. There are those who believe that our tradition, our scholarship, our art, and our philosophy have produced a fascinating mosaic of personality types. However, I'm sorry to inform you that the German spirit is much simpler. Sir, you'll be surprised to discover how easily the spirit can be deciphered and manipulated. However, it is not the kind of simplicity that you Americans are familiar with. It's a simplicity which, to understand it, you have to study its basic kernel in depth. For example, you have to understand the nature of educated German bourgeoisie. They are nothing like your boisterous East Coast natives. In short, it's a simplicity that you can reach only through careful unraveling. The last move in a chess game may seem simple, but is preceded by intense preparation. Actually, Milton has recently invested great efforts in studying the German market, said Fisk, relaxing in his chair and wrinkling his brow. Thomas got the impression that their meeting was giving him pleasure, and that he's provoking him to put him to the test. With all due respect, sir, my mother will chase lions in the Colosseum before the Americans understand the German mind. Have you read Ernst Jünger? Certainly not. He's a close friend. Do you know Pauli? The yearning for a great light is planted deep in our soul. If you haven't seen the crowd standing in the Winterfeld plots in the late evening, staring at the shining torches of Nivea, you haven't seen Germany. Are you familiar with the adjective Völkisch? It's actually a definition of the German essence that has no parallel in other language. And Naumann's theory concerning the state is a great business for the people's benefit. Are you familiar with it? Indeed, sir, you must at least agree with me that you can barely be defined as an expert on the German mind. True. Now the Reichsmark has been stabilized, and the economic situation has improved. But if you were to wander around Berlin a few years ago, you would have learned about the true essence of Germany. You'd have seen seemingly rational people inventing an absurd method of stabilization and simply printing money and eroding the currency until it wasn't even worth a shell at the